Hi everyone, welcome back to Mastering Change.
Today, we're joined by Ronia Fraser, a trauma recovery coach who specialises in healing after narcissistic abuse.
In this conversation, Ronia explains how emotional abuse impacts the nervous system, memory, identity, and why leaving is only the first step in a much longer process.
We talk about the subtle signs of coercive control, the trauma bond, and how survivors can start to rebuild trust in themselves.
Ronia also shares her own story and how she helps others move from confusion and self-blame to clarity and healing.
Let's begin. Thanks. Ronia Fraser, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, Ronia. So, as some of our podcast listeners will now already know, we start all podcasts with a little card game. On this card, there is a prompt, and the idea is that the prompt will lead into a little narrative or story that will help you connect to us and our audience connect to you. So, this card says, "The first time I can remember feeling embarrassed, dot, dot, dot."
Ooh. I don't really get embarrassed that easily, to be honest. The first time I felt embarrassed was...
Do you want me to go for a minute? Because I can remember it.
Go ahead.
I can remember being told, like sort of reprimanded by one of my mum and dad's friends. And I was like, what's that feeling? Like mum and dad would always like pull me up. But to have that by another adult who I don't know why, it just is like, and now I know that feeling was embarrassment, but it was like, I can't remember at what age, probably about 8.
Why was that embarrassing for you to be told
Because
off
it will have been in a public context, in a setting where other people will have heard somebody who wouldn't. I think if my parents had maybe done it, it would have been expected. But for another adult that was, I don't know, to kind of pull me up in a public, it was embarrassing. I will have been in a public situation in front of other people, but also me feeling like that probably wasn't their role to do it, but not having the confidence to sort of push back. So I can remember that quite viscerally.
Actually, now that you say that, I don't know exactly the situation, but I can very much relate to the sensation of what you just described. So it must have been in school at some point with a teacher, actually, and the class. And, everybody looks at you and everybody was laughing. I can't exactly remember what I said or what I did, but I got told off. And then it's very similar to what you just said, when people then all of a sudden look at you, right? And then especially when they laugh at you. And now I'm actually a public speaker, and I had to put quite some work on that to be able to do that, because I was always scared of the judgment. So now that you mention that, I think that actually came from that situation, or a similar situation, at around, like, I probably was about 6, I would say, like maybe first grade or second grade. I think it was first grade. So I probably wouldn't have known it to be embarrassment at that particular point in time. But when you were talking, I could feel that sensation. And so, yeah, I guess it was embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So if you wouldn't mind, just to the camera, say your name, introduce yourself, and then just a little bit about you to give our listeners a flavor.
My name is Ronia Fraser. I'm a multi-award-winning trauma recovery coach and clinical hypnotherapist, and I'm one of the leading experts in the field of narcissistic abuse recovery. And needless to say, you don't end up in a very specific line of work like that unless it has happened to you. So I am a survivor of narcissistic abuse myself. And since 2017, I've been working with abuse survivors from all over the world to help them get back on their feet, regain their mental health, and recover who they were always meant to be. I'm also an internationally published author. I'm a globally renowned speaker, and I am considered a pioneer in this field of narcissistic abuse recovery, because my approach is recognized as one of the most effective, structured, and masterful methods for the recovery from complex trauma in the aftermath of narcissistic abuse.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's a good place to start then. Can you start with describing narcissistic abuse? And then eventually I'd like us to get onto that framework, or is that the word you use, the framework that that's rooted, grounds your work. But first of all, can you just explain it to us what it is and how it shows up and how you might spot it or identify it?
Sure. So it's actually very, very important to talk about what narcissistic abuse really is, because it's become such a major buzzword, especially on social media, where it's just thrown around left, right, and center. And all of a sudden, everybody's a narcissist, and every relationship that breaks up was abusive, which of course isn't the case. So narcissistic abuse is actually emotional and psychological abuse on the most sophisticated level. So we are not talking about a heartbreak. We're talking something that goes much deeper than that. We're talking about emotional blackmail. We're talking about a very tactical erosion of identity. We're talking about systematic brainwash. So there is so much more to it. And it actually is one of the most common forms of abuse, but still the least recognized, even though it has become this buzzword. And it does have a very detrimental and life-altering impact on the mental health of the survivors. So that's why it is important we talk about it, and we talk about it in the right way and not just brush it off as like this, social media pop psychology thing that's going on right now.
So those hallmarks of narcissistic abuse, I don't know, can you contextualize that for us, like in some situations, or can you give us like some examples that help people recognize, understand that kind of phraseology into what does that mean in terms of what's happening, what people describe, how it's experienced?
Yeah, so narcissistic abuse, just to clarify, it doesn't always just happen in a romantic relationship, because that's the form of narcissistic abuse that gets talked about the most. It can happen in the workplace, it can happen in friendships, it can happen in families. And I think that's very important to understand that it's not exclusive to romantic relationships. And the challenge with identifying narcissistic abuse that most people have, I believe, is that the focus oftentimes is on the narcissist. There is like, oh, the 10 red flags of a narcissist and things like that. Everybody knows those red flags, but it doesn't stop us to actually find ourselves in those situations anyway, because it's always very simple to find excuses for other people's behavior, right? So we might recognize the red flag, but then we find an excuse because maybe they had a bad day at work or something like that. So when we want to identify whether we are actually experiencing narcissistic abuse in whatever kind of context, what is much more beneficial is actually paying attention to what is going on for us, rather than focusing on figuring out the narcissist. And there are actually certain quotes that every single narcissistic abuse survivor has said at some point or thought at some point. And if anybody is wondering whether they are in this situation, I mean, firstly, if you wonder about it, you already know your answer, really. But I would like to share those quotes with you, if that's okay, because that's something that then really resonates, because for everything that's going on within ourselves, there is no excuse, because that's real, right? That's actually happening. So a way to recognize whether we are dealing with a narcissist is, for example, I walk on eggshells all the time. So that's an indication that you are actually dealing with a toxic person, because when we engage with a healthy person, we don't feel that way, right? We feel safe in ourselves. We feel safe expressing our opinion. But when we deal with a narcissist, what happens is, because the mask comes on and off at will, we never know who we're dealing with. So as a result, what will happen is that we actually start compromising ourselves. We start compromising our values, our needs, our opinions, right? And because we want to keep that monster at bay, we become very inauthentic in who we are, and we get that feeling that we always have to walk on eggshells just to be safe. So if you have the feeling that you're walking on eggshells around a particular person in whichever context, that's an indication that something isn't right here. Another quote is, I think I'm going crazy. I think I'm losing my mind. And that is an indication for gaslighting. And gaslighting is another one of those pop psychology terms now, because I've actually heard people go like, oh, stop gaslighting me just because somebody had a different opinion or was disagreeing. That's not what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is actually a form of mental torture. And what happens is that the abuser actually distorts the reality to such an extent that a person on the receiving end feels like they are losing their mind, right? And they actually are at that particular point in time. And gaslighting is a very interesting topic. I do whole lectures just on that. But if you have said or thought, oh my God, I think I'm losing my mind, that's an indication that gaslighting is at play here. Another very common quote is, I don't recognize the person looking back at me in the mirror. And that is one of the most soul destroying aspects of narcissistic abuse. And I already mentioned the very tactical erosion of identity earlier. So that's an indication that that's happening, because all of a sudden you look at yourself, but you don't recognize that person. Sometimes you don't see nothing at all. So I don't know, I don't recognize the person looking back at me in the mirror. Very, very common. And another one, actually, very important one, is I feel like an addict, or he or she is my drug, my kryptonite, in whatever version those words come out of our mouth. And that's something that's very relevant in the very beginning, actually, when somebody doesn't have the language yet to explain what's going on because they don't know yet. And I remember myself using those exact words as well, because I knew something was very wrong. And I wanted to express myself to my friends so they would understand that this is actually not me. Like there is something really off, but I didn't know what I was dealing with. So I would also say, I feel like I'm an addict. I don't know what's wrong, but I feel like I'm an addict. And I actually had like physical withdrawal symptoms, like my body would be shaking. And I couldn't find any other way to express it. And that actually is an indication for trauma bonding. And the thing is, trauma bonding, it doesn't only feel like an addiction, it actually is a chemical dependency in the brain. It's also called love addiction. And that one in particular, I think, is actually the key of understanding every abuse survivor, and also a key in understanding how to get somebody out the other side of this, because it's not just feeling like an addiction. We're dealing with an actual chemical dependency in the brain in narcissistic relationships.
I'm so glad you said that, actually, because that's exactly what I was hoping you were going to lead into, in this idea of like kind of trauma bonding, love addiction, the fact that, the reason why, as you said, keep the narcissist outside of the conversation, really, because it's actually dealing with that
Absolutely.
going on with the person who is staying in that relationship. Why are they staying? What is it feeding? What is it giving to them? What is it? What is it? Like in an addictive relation, like an addictive, if you're an addict to a substance, the substance is a symptom. No, the substance is at first soothing something, it's helping something. So what is the narcissist giving to the abused person, really? What kind of role is it playing that is helping at first before it becomes really destructive? And I'd be interested in understanding your opinion around that.
So how the whole concept of trauma bonding works, you mean?
You start with that, but no, I wanted to know, like, if you're talking about a substance, an addiction to a substance, basically you take that substance to numb some form of pain generally, right? Some form of, you're using a substance to as a tool. It's like it's a tool for survival of something deeper that's
Exactly.
the issue, right? So the
Yeah.
narcissist is that kind of, at first the behavior of the narcissist will be soothing, or will be
Mm.
helping you to survive, or soothe something, some internal pain generally. And I'm just interested, I don't know enough about narcissism,
Mm-hmm.
or the abused, the people who live with narcissists, what it could be, the pain that's going on inside of them to then want to attach to the narcissist.
Yeah, it's not even a want, right? Because as you said, a narcissist offers something that in that moment we're desperate for to have. And of course, the substance we're talking about is love. And everybody who's ever been in love knows that love is literally the highest high there is, right? That's why the trauma bond also feels like true love. It has nothing to do with love, but it feels like true love and the most intense love experience that we've ever experienced in our lives. And it is all set up in that way because when we think about how a narcissist actually sets the trap, as you said, they offer something that their target wants. And if you think about it, we all want to be loved. We all want to belong, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's a very basic human desire to have. However, if there are some faulty programs running in the background along the lines of, for example, feeling unworthy, feeling unlovable, feeling unseen, unheard, a very, very universal faulty program that a lot of women and men have running in the background unconsciously is not feeling good enough, right? And when the narcissist comes in, like it creeps in, with a smile under the pretense of true love and immense trust. But then it very, very quickly erodes, right? It's not like, unlike pouring drain unblocker down your sink. Within like minutes, you have corrosions within, or seconds even, and then within minutes, you have the erosion of the underlying block. But if we actually apply that to ourselves, that erosion and corrosion is happening to our reality, to our identity. And the trap really is, and that's part of the healing where we can actually, hold on to and grab something, is what is it that they actually offered that you were so desperate for to have? And people don't always have an answer to that, but you can also turn it around. What was it that you are holding on to, right? Because we stay in those relationships, even though deep down we already know, or consciously we know they are not good for us. What is it that you are holding on to that would go away? And it has already gone away, but we want it back, right? And that's the trauma bonding aspect, where in the brain, in the beginning with all the love bombing, they say all the right things, everything that we want to hear. They make us feel loved and make us feel so special, put us on a pedestal, really, stroke our ego. And then what chemically happens, of course, is, there's a lot of dopamine, a lot of oxytocin, a lot of serotonin, and under normal circumstances, of course, that's a good thing, right? It's hormones that make us feel good. It's hormones that help us bond to people. But of course, with a narcissist, it's so extreme that the brain basically gets overstimulated with that input, and then all of a sudden they take it away. All of a sudden, the gaslighting comes in, the identity erosion comes in, and it's very subtle. It might be something they say, and you go like, did they just say that? Because it doesn't fit that person you think right? And then you brush it off. You must have misheard or something. But then it just continues and continues. And what happens then is that all these feel good chemicals get replaced by a very natural stress response. So all of a sudden we have adrenaline flooding our system. We have cortisol flooding our system. And of course, what does the body want? What does the mind want? We want to feel good again, right? So then the very first time this actually happens, most people will try to get away. They will go like, no, even if you just have a tiny, tiny little bit of self-respect, you go like, I'm not being treated like that. But what does a narcissist do? They put the mask back on. And then all of a sudden there's the oxytocin, the dopamine, the serotonin again. So we are on a high again. And because of this intermittent reinforcement of reward and punishment, what happens is that there is actually this chemical dependency that's forming in the brain. And that's also what makes it so difficult to walk away, because if you ask any narcissistic abuse survivor what made them stay or what made them go back, it's because of feeling that good again. But of course, that doesn't happen again, right? It was only the beginning. It was only the trap. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
It really does. And so I think that's a really great point to talk about what the interventions, what breaks the cycle, what creates the change, because the addiction, as you described it, is such a dependency, is so gripping. How do you begin to kind of break that down?
So the very first thing that needs to happen is no contact. That's also the hardest thing to do, because if you put it in context of addiction, all of a sudden it makes so much more sense why people are so resistant. And of course, another part is that narcissistic abuse, the whole illusion that's created is that you cannot survive without the other person. There will be no other person who can meet your needs. That's a big part of trauma bonding. But it's an illusion, right? So if we put it in context of an addiction, of course, what needs to happen is to cut off the supply. And that is something where literally everybody finds 110 reasons why no contact does not apply to their particular situation. But it does, because we cannot heal in an environment that makes us sick in the first place, right? So no contact is the rule number one for narcissistic abuse recovery. And of course, there are situations that are more complicated. There are children involved, there are legal proceedings ongoing maybe, but there is still ways to minimize the contact to such an extent that we can create a safe space around us that allows that healing to happen. And as we undergo the healing process, the way we deal with the challenges that are being thrown at us also changes, right? Because we become more resilient. And I can talk you through how we can actually, break that trauma bond step by step. But no contact, it's a non-negotiable. There's no ifs, there's no buts. No contact has to be put in place. And what also happens once somebody goes no contact is that the nervous system very, very quickly regulates. And it's literally like self-care decision number one you can do for yourself. And of course, when our nervous system starts regulating, all of a sudden we have so many more options available to us, because we are not reacting, we are responding to the situation. So that's the very first thing that needs to happen. And then it's quite multi-layered. Narcissistic abuse recovery is quite multi-layered, because first of all, what needs to happen is that we stabilize the emotional well-being, right? So when somebody comes to me, they exhibit complex post-traumatic stress symptoms. They are not functioning in their day-to-day life. Most likely, they are not even able to go grocery shopping, because obviously the nervous system is on such high alert and completely dysregulated. So the very, very first thing that needs to happen is regulating the nervous system to, be able to get their feedback on the ground. So they are functioning again. So that's the very first step that needs to happen. And then
how do you do that?
How do I do that?
Yeah.
So a tool that I use, which I love, is havening techniques. Are you familiar with havening techniques?
I'm not.
It's a psychosensory modality. It's very, very simple, but very effective. It's a psychosensory modality that's based on touch. And you can do it yourself, which makes it so beautiful. It's the very first tool I teach every single one of my clients, because my intention is, of course, to equip them with the tools to become self-reliant rather than reliant on me. And havening is a tool that very quickly, within literally seconds, regulates your nervous system. And I mean, I can show you,
please.
if you want.
Yeah.
So I
We could
explain
all
it.
do
So
with those tools.
exactly. So, and it's so, so, so simple and so effective. So you put your left hand on the right shoulder and the right hand on the left shoulder, which sounds much more complicated than it is, actually. And then you start stroking from the shoulder to the elbow in one direction. One direction from the shoulder to the elbow. And I mean, right now it's very hot, so it might not be the most pleasant thing to do. But what you can probably already feel is how soothing this actually is. And what's happening here is that we create delta brain waves, which are highly relaxing. So if you are in a situation where you feel anxious, sad, any sort of emotional overwhelm, this very, very quickly regulates the nervous system. And you can also do the face, like the forehead, the cheeks. And if you think about it, what do we do when we get stressed? We rub our forehead, right? So it's not rocket science. It's just becoming aware of how we can utilize things that we already do to our advantage. And my favorite version actually is the public friendly version, which is rubbing your hands together in a circular motion. And this one is something and you can do anytime, anywhere. So you have a difficult conversation, you're sitting in court, you are negotiating something, you are on public transport and you feel nervous. You can do that on the table, under the table, it doesn't matter because nobody knows what you're doing there. But what you are actually doing is you're regulating your nervous system right in the moment it's happening. And I mean, I'm blowing my cover a little bit here because like I use it on stage and for me at this point, this is completely unconscious. When my nervous system feels I need to regulate, sometimes I even catch myself doing that without having been aware of it, where I go like, oh, that's interesting. So it's very, very simple. There are deeper interventions we can do with havening where you would go to a certified practitioner, of course. But the self-havening touch, it's something that is so effective and everybody can do it right away. And as you can feel yourself now, it's very calming, it's very soothing. And when we are in a relaxed state, when our nervous system is regulated, we deal with situations in a very different way than if we are firing from an emotional trigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then another thing that needs to happen is that we remove the triggers, which is a very typical post-traumatic stress symptom, right? The flashbacks, the triggers. And with narcissistic abuse, it's really an all sensory experience because you go to the grocery store and somebody walks past that wears the same perfume, or you see somebody that drives past with the same kind of car, or you walk past a place where there is a memory, so it's highly, highly activating. And what's very important actually here and is different to a normal post-traumatic stress intervention where we disconnect emotional triggers is with narcissistic abuse. Remember, we're talking about an addiction, right? And the addiction is not the bad stuff that happened. If it was only for the bad stuff that happened, nobody ever would go back. The drug, right? It's all the good memories because our brain can't distinguish if something's happening for real or whether we're imagining it. So as somebody is replaying all those amazing experiences, and they were amazing, right? For the mind, for the body, it's as if it's happening again and again. So even if we've already left, we're still feeding that addiction. And that's why we stay connected with the abuser, even if we don't want to. It's literally the chemical reaction in the brain. So when we then deal with those triggers and neutralizing the flashbacks and the triggers, we actually with narcissistic abuse recovery need to also neutralize all the positive experiences. And that's how to very effectively break the trauma bond, because that's where the addiction sits. And that's one of the keys to narcissistic abuse recovery, because oftentimes, people focus on all the bad stuff that has happened. But the key with narcissistic abuse recovery and what is keeping people hooked is all the fantastic stuff that happened. because that's what you want back. And that's why all of those experiences need to be completely neutralized. So instead of, sitting here in the prefrontal cortex and not being filed away and constantly being present, it allows us to file them away as memories. Of course, they happened, and we can take our learnings from that whole experience, but we don't have any emotional charge to the whole experience anymore. And that is very, very important. And that's what then stabilizes the emotional well-being. And what now happens, if somebody even gets that far, they're usually sent off, because at that point, they're functioning. Their emotional well-being is stabilized. They feel good about themselves. They are not connected to the narcissist as such. But what happens if we let somebody go at that particular point in time is they most likely will be back within 6 months or a year, because they just found another narcissist, a different shade of narcissist. And that's also why it's so important that we don't focus on narcissists at all, because they evolve and there's so many different shades. There is no way in the world we can ever figure all of them out. And then we think we know everything. And I mean, to be honest, I haven't met a narcissistic abuse survivor that couldn't write a PhD on the topic. But despite of that, they're not feeling better. And all of a sudden they find themselves in the same situation. Again, the situation they never thought could ever possibly happen again. And the reason for that is because, as already Araminda mentioned earlier, it goes so much deeper than that, because of course, the narcissist still has something to offer that we are desperate for to have. That void within ourselves hasn't been resolved, right? That is still there. So we think we feel better. We have all of this knowledge, so we feel safe. And then all of a sudden there's a different kind of narcissist dangles basically the same carrot in front of our nose, and we go and grab it again. And then here we are again. So that's why it's important that narcissistic abuse recovery actually goes even deeper than that and explore those questions. Okay, so what is this actually really about? What is it that happens here over and over again? And that's where then it goes into developmental trauma, where we explore faulty programming, outdated programming that actually gets us into trouble. And I already mentioned some of those programs that are running there in the background. And up until this point, those programs will have been unconscious, right?
Are you talking, sorry, just to clarify there for me, those cycles, it's not necessarily with the same person.
No.
If you've been with one narcissistic person, then you might be more predisposed to seek out another narcissist.
Yeah, so as long as your internal operating system still runs exactly the same, the likelihood that you will find yourself in the same situation is very high. And whether that's going back to the same person or whether it's, getting involved with somebody else, whether all of a sudden you find yourself in a narcissistic work situation, it all comes down to the same faulty program, if you will, that makes that possible. Because if you think about it, all of those games don't work with everybody. There are people, they just walk away. They go like, no, I'm not putting up with this. So they have a different kind of operating system running than the person that stays.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And that's why it's important that we explore what this is actually really about, and run an update on that. Because that's the only way that we can ensure it won't happen again in the future. Because what happens when we resolve this is, obviously they are not going to disappear from the face of the earth. We know that they are everywhere, but you have nothing to offer them anymore, and they have nothing to offer you anymore. So you are basically just, if you cross path, you just walk past, or even if they try to lure you in, you notice straight away. And the walking away is easy, rather than the kind of like, oh, maybe, let me prove myself wrong kind of thing.
I love how you're describing it as an update to the operating system. Do you know what I mean? I was just coming from that kind of tech. There's like a real, I find it somewhat liberating, because it talks about the fact that it talks about neuroplasticity in a way that kind of can help people understand that they can
But it also talks about healing, right? And
it
when you hear,
really does.
for
Yeah.
me, when you're like from someone who has healed from addiction, I know that I can be in front of my old drug of choice and know that it has nothing to offer me anymore. The only thing it
Exactly.
does is repulses me. It pushes me away from that. Like, I don't want that at all in my life anymore. And I really resonate with that. And I think, but that has to come from a place. I had that hole in my soul and I had to fill that with whatever, for something from me internally. I had to do that work to make sure that hole was healed. Um,
I think the
so
same about my relationship with food. I had a point in my life where I was addicted to food, and the way you've described the kind of, that but the feeling that it gives the dopamine, those happy hormones, and then the converse of that. So I think the parallels that, I mean, we all draw reference points from our own
Of
experiences,
course.
don't we? But yeah, so the first thing is no contact, then the regulation of the nervous system using this technique, then removing the triggers, and that's the point at which you're looking at that kind of neuroplastic. I'm guessing that's where the clinical
Yes, yes.
hypnotherapy comes in. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, I use a blend of different tools. Havening techniques I already mentioned. I use hypnosis. I use neurolinguistic programming and coaching, some energy work as well. And what's important to understand, I think, with narcissistic abuse is that it impacts us on every level of our being. So, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. If you think about trauma bonding, of course, we can explain it with neuroscience, but it's also this incredibly strong, energetic bond that is shared there. And that's why it's important that the narcissistic abuse recovery process is multi-layered and it has really practical tools to address all those different layers. And I mean, of course, we are all different, right? So the approach also has to be fluent enough to accommodate everybody else's needs, individual needs. But at the same time, it has to be very structured and it has to step out of the cognitive function. Because as most narcissistic abuse survivors know, they've talked about it, maybe even for years, maybe they've done, their counseling for years, but nothing has actually changed. And that's because the healing of trauma, as we know, doesn't happen in the cognitive function. So even if you write a PhD on the topic, even if you write a book about your story, it hasn't actually, filled that hole or that void from the inside out. And all three of us, as we're sitting here in our own experiences, we know that no person, no food, no substance can actually fill that. We need to do that ourselves from the inside out.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so how long might somebody work with you? So you work on a one-to-one basis or group work? How does your, obviously we know all of your public facing profile, or if anybody doesn't, they should definitely look you up. But in terms of the approach that you're advocating for, what is it that you want to scale? How do you see what you know and this approach that you're adopting being able to impact more people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse?
So I do offer group coaching and one-on-one coaching. I don't do it that much anymore because, I'm very much doing public speaking now, raising awareness, not only about narcissistic abuse, but sharing practical solutions. I'm giving training to medical professionals, coaches, therapists, so they can actually help their clients better. And now that the awareness has shifted, of course, the demand is much even higher than it already was. And so from a scalable point of view, my focus at the moment is training. So I train professionals as well as survivors in my approach, which is, again, it's multi-layered. It consists hypnotherapy, it consists my personal protocol, it consists like little tools, because not everything needs to be a major intervention. There are a lot of little things that we can do very easily in our day-to-day life that completely changes how we feel about ourselves, about our lives. And my intention is to get somebody up and running as quickly as possible, and for them to build their own toolbox, practical toolbox, which isn't only going to be beneficial for that particular situation that they're dealing with right now, but for life in general, because life always throws curveballs at us, right?
Yeah,
And
great.
as I said, my focus at the moment is training, just to equip more people all over the world. Like in my last training, I had 7 different countries. And so to be able to, give the people the practical tools that are needed. And to answer your question, how long that process takes, well, that depends on every person, right? You cannot put a time scale on it as such, because we all heal at our own pace. However, if you have the right tools and the right support, like my program is designed for narcissistic abuse recovery. It's very clearly structured to address all those different levels. My average amount of sessions I do with a client is 6 sessions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. That's really clear. So I'm going to ask you the same question that we ask all of our podcast guests. And it's, it's going to take us right out there, but we live in a world of huge fear and anxiety and doubt. If you go globally and look at the kind of geopolitical, the climate crisis, the wars, the display, all that's happening on the really big level, come down to kind of community and society, and then community, then work colleagues, family, significant other, relationship with self. There's many reasons for those to be frayed or fractured. If there was a single lever for change that would affect the kind of change that we need to see in the world, what would that lever for change be?
One of my favorite sayings is energy flows where the attention goes. And I think, it sounds very simplistic, but if people would be more aware of that and how much in control they actually are of their own thoughts, of their own reality, I think that would make a big difference. So instead of, focusing on the narcissist, focusing on the news, focusing on social media, to really consciously curate where you spend your energy, because that completely changes the whole life experience. It's not going to change, obviously, what's going on around us right now, but it will very much impact the mental health of yourself. And if you change your inside, your outside naturally will change. I don't know if that answers your question.
Perfect.
But that's something, like, if you see my social media, and I'm one of the leading experts in the field, you will find nothing about narcissistic abuse at all. Like, you find cat videos and stuff like that. But I'm very, very protective of my energy and where I put my attention towards to. And we all kind of sometimes lapse, but you can feel it straight away, and then you go like, oh, hold on a second, my energy is actually going in the wrong direction here.
Perfect. Great. Ronia, it's been a pleasure having you today. Thank you
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ronia. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really, it's been such a fascinating talk. So really appreciate it.
Thank you.